Well, I'm continuing our talk with Professor Curran and his report. I mean, do you feel everything is going to be acted upon? I mean, it's quite a deadline you've set there, but Parliament's always slip. I mean, it's been, it's one of those things. Do you believe the Isle of Man is totally on board with this, and the government particularly, obviously?
As far as I can tell, Paul, yes. In all the discussions I've had with the ministers and the members of Tynwald, and indeed various people I've met across the island and various businesses and so on. And I think also it's shown very strongly in the government's action plan. Yeah, I do seriously believe that this report and the action plan are going to be delivered. For me, one of the key issues, which is perhaps the next most important stage, is making sure the governance is right. Now, that's a kind of technical term, but it's the kind of structures and mechanisms by which delivery will be taken forward. Who ultimately is responsible for doing what particular tasks? I think if that is put in place quickly, and if it's designed the right way, so that the 60 actions that are in the government's action plan for working on over the next year, so that they can be tracked and monitored and reported on and chased up if they're slipping a little bit behind, or celebrated indeed if they're ahead of schedule. I think as long as that mechanism is put in place and functions well, then that will follow through on what I believe is very high level of commitment, as far as I'm able to judge anyway.
Okay, well, they're putting millions of pounds aside for this. Is it 25 million or something a year? And tree planting is up there. Again, these are things that everyone's been told to do. Is it going to make the big difference? And will it happen to the degree that it has to happen and pretty well quite quickly, I guess?
Yeah, as I said earlier, the recreation of natural ecosystems and rebuilding forests and peatlands and so on is urgent, because it takes time for it to create the best possible rates of sequestration and so on. It doesn't happen in the first year. It takes 10 or 20 years for woodlands to get to a sufficient scale that they're absorbing a lot of carbon, and it takes a while for peatlands to recover and start absorbing carbon as well. And it's the same for the marine environment, blue carbon as it's called, recreating salt marshes. And it takes time for these to rebuild and start functioning well. So these are some of the most urgent actions, alongside, as we said earlier, getting the whole population and all the businesses and civic sectors on side with the plan and doing everything that they can to support it.
Now, by the very nature of the Isle of Man being an island, people have to fly, or obviously they've got the boat, but flying is very much an essential way for most people to get from A to B. You have views on that? I mean, is it something we should curtail?
Yeah, well, when I come across to the island, I have to fly as well, and I remember way back being asked about that, and certainly I'm offsetting those flights. I have made contributions to tree planting schemes that are kind of audited and believable and credible. It's far from ideal. It's not the best thing, but it's better than doing nothing. And again, the report recommends that some scheme be put in place on the Isle of Man, so that if people choose to offset, then there's a route for them to do that will be creating ecosystems that absorb carbon on the Isle of Man. So that would be a nice thing to have in place. But again, it's an area where we can see technology changing quite rapidly. There are already experimental aircraft that are electric, and I believe taking maybe 20 passengers, and they can fly about 200 miles or something. And I'm sure I've read somewhere that within a couple of years there should be commercially available electric passenger planes, small and short haul. But for much of the travel from the Isle of Man, that may be just about all that's needed at the moment. Hopping across to Manchester and Birmingham, and for myself up here to Scotland and so on, maybe those electric driven planes are going to be available actually fairly soon. And shipping is developing in the same way. There are electric ferries, again, not huge capacity and perhaps not suitable for the rather exposed waters of the Irish Sea, but they are being designed and constructed. Some are already available, some are already in operation. So I think these technologies will feed through fairly quickly. And as long as options are kept open as long as possible, as long as the market is kept under review so that the appropriate technology can be brought in at the appropriate time, then in these areas which are some of the difficult ones to reduce carbon emissions, then that's probably the best thing we can do at the moment.
Okay, well, finally, Alf Cannon, the Treasury Minister, is obviously penning his budget, which is coming in February. Do you want to see more support for people with electric cars, more charging points? I think you mentioned that in the thing. Are you surprised how we don't have a very forward policy with the MUA for giving grants, for instance, to put in charging points at houses, for instance?
Yeah, and it was in my report that elements like that need to be looked at, but equally it was a report that these potential mechanisms, be it grants or interest-free loans or lower costs on vehicle registration and so on, they all need to be looked at. There is no one immediate answer, certainly not to me. So it's quite right that in this first year, when the government has already put aside 10 million to fund some of the actions that are going to get underway immediately, but also to have available the resources to look into options, then that is the right way to do it. I mean, the government spends public money. They need to be responsible in the way they do that. So I think looking at the various options around incentivizing the shift that we all want to see towards electric vehicles, towards emission-free heating of houses and so on, it's worth trying and testing and optioneering around that to find out what will be the best incentivization mechanisms on and for the island. So okay. I welcome that effort being put in year one to try and devise the very best solutions, and then in year two onwards really start putting the foot on the accelerator.
And just bring it all into context, the Isle of Man produces a very, very small amount of all the world footprint of carbon, doesn't it? I mean, this is a very small amount, but obviously, understandably, for most people, they are concerned and they want to do their piece.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that argument is often raised. It's a tiny percentage of global emissions, and then people will often say, well, the emissions in China, for example, which are virtually a third of the world emissions now, are increasing, so why should we bother? Well, I think that's one of the very reasons why we all should bother. It's really important that developed nations set an example, and the United Nations in the Paris Agreement made that point very clearly, that the developed nations must and should take the lead. I think there's a moral obligation to do that. And indeed, China, under the Paris Agreement, is allowed to increase its emissions for a little while and then begin to reduce them rapidly. And China is investing very, very heavily in renewable energy. But it's also the workshop of the world. So we do kind of offshore some of our emissions by importing a lot of our goods and materials from China. So their emissions are actually benefiting us in some way. So we need to demonstrate leadership, show commitment to the United Nations principles, and China and others will follow at the appropriate time and under international agreements. Okay. And then people will often also point to the United States, where, yes, at the federal level, there's a certain degree of antipathy towards anything to do with climate change, which is really disappointing. But don't forget that the individual states are the ones who are actually delivering the carbon reductions, and some of the individual states in the USA are doing remarkable things. So, you know, we shouldn't just write off.
Okay. Finally, how are we left? Sorry, to finish with it. How are we left with you now? Are you on board? Are you making reports? Are you the policeman for this thing? Where's it go for you?
Okay, I mean, that's been discussed at a very informal level. And in the same way that I very much hope, and it's clear, I think, that the government very much hope, and all of Tynwald hopes, that there is real commitment from everybody on the Isle of Man to this plan to tackle climate change, I'm very happy to continue with my commitment. But we haven't explored that in detail yet. There's been so much effort put in by the analytical team, by Tynwald, by the ministers, to getting us to this point, that there really hasn't been time to discuss in any detail my personal future. But I've certainly said that I'm very happy to continue in some role, and I think there's an interest in me continuing in some aspect of providing advice in the future. But I simply don't know the detailed answer to that yet, Paul.